Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking about an exciting new update to the Sony A1 that makes it an even more capable camera, an even more versatile camera that will enable it to be more useful in more situations. I'm referring specifically to update 1.30, which does add the ability to the Sony A1 to shoot in smaller RAW formats. Now, I think this is really useful, especially if you are a professional event shooter, if you do a lot for social media, for example, where you don't necessarily need the full 50 megapixels, just because with that, you're gonna have much larger file sizes. In a lot of situations, all you really need is pretty much the bare minimum, as long as it's something that you just want to post on social media and your client's just accepting digital delivery and nothing's ever going to get printed out. I feel like in these situations, having a lower resolution definitely helps out a lot. In my opinion, having the flexibility of shooting smaller RAW file sizes definitely is something that only helps and encourages me to shoot more with this camera. Now, in order to get these smaller RAW file sizes, you do need to be on the latest firmware as of now, which is version 1.30. After that, you'll be able to immediately start shooting in smaller RAW file sizes. And basically, this isn't available in the uncompressed RAW format. This is only available for the lossless compressed formats. You can go into your menu and go into image quality settings, and here you have additional options of lossless compressed medium and small. So the large, that one was the same exact thing as the normal lossless compressed previously. It's just now called large. And yeah, these are the two new options that you have, lossless compressed medium and small. Of course, when you're shooting in the large version of the lossless compressed format, you're gonna get the full 50 megapixels. And then when you scale down to the new medium RAW file size, you're gonna get 21 megapixels. And then going down further to the small file, you're gonna get 12 megapixels. All in all, these are very useful sizes from 50 to 21 to 12 megapixels. And I feel like that gives definitely a really good range in terms of the different applications. I find that RAW files in the 20s megapixel range is pretty much good for most things nowadays. That's why you have a lot of entry-level cameras around 24 megapixels. And I feel like it's a good balance between not being super heavy on the file size front, but at the same time, it's better than some cameras that are only like 12 megapixels. I do have a Sony a7S III, and that one does shoot 12 megapixels. I find that my primary usage for that in terms of photography tends to be for social media purposes only. If I do anything with print, then I definitely do need to use a different camera just so I can get more megapixels and more details and be able to print in a larger format. Now, what I found interesting is what happens if you pair the APS-C crop mode with these new smaller RAW file formats. When you use a regular RAW format, which is the full size, you do get 50 megapixels if you're not using APS-C mode. If you're just shooting in full frame mode, then if you crop into APS-C mode, then you'll get 21 megapixels. It basically just crops the center portion, which is APS-C sized, and pretty much does not record the rest of it. So basically you're getting a smaller part of the sensor, and it produces a smaller megapixel count as a result. So basically you're just throwing away the rest of the information that's not contained within that APS-C sized box. Of course, whenever you use crop mode, this is basically what happens. But what I noticed is if you use either the medium or the small RAW file formats, then the resolution actually doesn't change. So if you're using 21 megapixel full frame format and you then suddenly switch to crop, you're still gonna get 21 megapixels. And I found that pretty interesting. And I feel that that's actually really useful, because then if you're shooting an event, for example, and you're just shooting in medium RAW format, then all of your photos are going to be 21 megapixels, and you don't have the huge discrepancy when you're shooting in the normal RAW mode and you have 50 megapixel files and then you have 21 megapixel files, and then it tends to be like all over the place in terms of file size. But with this, you get a much more consistent result. The exact same thing happens when you shoot in small RAW format size. If you do that, then it's still going to be 12 megapixels regardless of if you shoot in full frame mode or APS-C mode. What I also found especially interesting was the file sizes of these new RAW file formats. So I basically did a few test shots shooting in all of these modes. When I shot uncompressed RAW, I got 102 megabytes for the 50 megapixel full frame file, and then 43 megabytes for the cropped 21 megapixel file. Now, when I switched to lossless compressed, of course, these multiple RAW file sizes open up to me, and shooting in the large format, which is exactly the same dimensions as the uncompressed versions, I got 57 megabytes for the full frame and 26 megabytes for the cropped versions. Switching over to the medium RAW files at both 21 megapixels for the full frame and 21 megapixels for the cropped, I got around 31 megabytes for the full frame and 26 megabytes for the cropped. And switching over to the small RAW formats at 12 megapixels and 12 megapixels for both full frame and RAW, I got both of them at 25 megabytes. Of course, your specific file size is going to vary depending on the particular content of your image. If you have a lot more relative information and fewer blown out highlights, then you're likely going to have larger formats, but I would assume that this range is roughly representative of what you're going to get. So what was particularly interesting to me is that when I shot with small RAW, it wasn't that much smaller in terms of file size compared to the medium RAW format. All the files that I was getting, they ranged from 25 megabytes to around 30 megabytes, and then the medium RAW ranged from like 27 megabytes to 33 megabytes. So there wasn't that much of a difference between 12 megapixels and 21 megapixels. Of course, there was a pretty big difference between the 21 megapixels and 51. It pretty much is half the size in terms of the RAW file size. So yeah, this result is pretty surprising because I do have the A7S III, as I mentioned, and when I shoot in lossless compressed mode, the RAW file sizes of those 12 megapixel files are only around 10 to 15 megabytes. And so compare that to here, where when we shoot in small RAW 12 megapixels, you do get double that, around 25 megabytes per file. So I found that particularly interesting, and if those are the results, then I feel like at this point it might be more worth it just to shoot in medium RAW. That way you do get a big file size reduction, but at the same time you do get a lot more resolution than 12 megapixels. Here you do have 21 megapixels and you can print a lot more compared to the 12 megapixel files, and at the same time it doesn't cost that much more storage space. It's around 30 megabytes versus 25 megabytes, and to me, I think that ends up being pretty worth it if I'm going on vacation and I'm taking just kind of more casual snaps, or if I'm shooting an event. And with the additional resolution, you're able to crop in a little bit more compared to just having a 12 megapixel file. In terms of the image quality, I would say all of these RAW file sizes are fantastic. I was doing a few test shots with a bunch of these different files, and coming out of the A1, I mean, all the RAW files are beautiful. And I was looking a little bit more closely at the 12 megapixel files, and they look very sharp. And I don't know if they're like downsampled, or I don't know how exactly Sony does this RAW conversion from 50 to 12 megapixels, but it does seem a little bit more detailed than my A7S III files, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't done any in-depth tests, but just to my eye, they just seem really, really sharp. So maybe that's why the file sizes are a little bigger. Not entirely sure, But all in all, I just feel like they do not seem compromised in any way that I could discover in my time just testing all these files. But yeah, I feel like this was a great update by Sony, especially for event shooters who might not necessarily need the 50 megapixels for every file. And I think it's also great for people who are hoping to bring their A1 to more casual shoots, like going on vacation and whatnot, where you also might not necessarily need the 50 megapixel files. I think overall it just gives a lot of versatility to the camera, a lot more options, which I think is always good. So yeah, those are my thoughts on a new update for the Sony A1. I look forward to seeing you next time.